said, fine, it's fine, we'll publish it this way. But he has since been asking me if I'd be willing to write a short version of it. And so I'm working on that actually. So I'm working on like a much shorter, much simpler version of it. And so I am using you as a test run on a couple of those chapters. So, but mainly because the first one, because it's the one that surprised me the most. And the second one, because it's the one that I think in some ways is the easiest to understand, but the hardest one to know how to put into practice. So the first beatitude that I chose to talk about is, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." And when I say the word meek, I want you to tell me what you think of. What do you think of when I say the word meek?
Father Wakahi. From MASH.
The
chaplain in MASH.
The chaplain in MASH.
Father McCain?
That's
great.
The chaplain in MASH. I am slightly too young to.
It was a radio show. It was really good.
Okay. I've heard of it. Okay. What else do you think of when you heard the word meek? Deferential. Bashful.
Reserved.
Casper Milk Toast.
Casper Milk Toast. Humble. Tameable. When I hear the word meek, I tend to think of someone who's kind of mild and humble and maybe timid, maybe is easy to push around, just kind of a meek little person. When I started reading about the Beatitudes, this is the thing, as I said earlier, that surprised me the most. And what I discovered is that up until about the 17 or 1800s, there was almost unanimous agreement on what this word meant and on what the Beatitude meant. And meekness was the virtue of knowing how to restrain your anger. It was how to rightly use and practice anger. And I thought, are you sure that's what it was? Because that's not what I thought. And the more I kept reading, the more I was like, is this an outlier? No, it was everybody. It was so consistent. And so I want to talk a little bit about why that is. But before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about the three places that this Greek word, praus, is used in Matthew's gospel. Because both of the Beatitudes I'm talking about tonight are unique to Matthew's version of the Beatitudes. So they're not in Luke's. So these are just Matthew's. And he uses the word praus 3 times. The first one is in the Beatitude, and the other 2 are about Jesus. So this is my next slide. And so this, of course, is a picture of Jesus famously overturning the tables in the temple. This is a movie still from a movie, and I have seen this movie, and for the life of me, I cannot remember which one it is, so I apologize for that. I tried to find it, but it was a movie still that was just, unaccredited images are one of the banes of my teaching existence on the internet, as you can imagine. But twice in Matthew's gospel, Jesus is described as meek, using the same Greek word, praus. So the first one is not that young. Matthew 11:29. Jesus describes himself as gentle and humble in heart. And the word gentle is the Greek word praus. So he is gentle and humble in heart. And then the second time is when in Matthew 21:5, it is the Zechariah passage that is quoted at the beginning of the triumphal entry when Jesus is entering into Jerusalem. And it is given as the explanation for why Jesus is riding on a donkey instead of a war stallion, which is what you would expect a king to be riding on when he rides into the city. And it says, "Your king is coming to you humble, praus, and mounted on a donkey." So Same Greek word, 3 English words. The translator has once again committed a minor act of betrayal. Meek, gentle, humble. In Zechariah 9 through 10, which is where this quotation comes from, it says that this meek king banishes the tools of war and speaks peace to the nations. So that's the backdrop to this Zechariah quotation. So I think the first thing to say about whatever meekness is that it is embodied by Jesus. And that it is something that someone can be and still be capable of overturning a few tables when the need calls for it. But I want to go back to this question of where did this come from, this understanding of meekness as the restraint of anger. And then after I do that, maybe just a little bit about where it got lost along the way. So where did it come from? So you can go to the next slide. So this idea of disciplined self-restraint when angry, I think we can actually see this a little bit in the word gentle, which is why I like the word gentle as a translation better than meek, because we still use this as a verb when we talk about gentling a wild horse, right? And so gentling a wild horse is to take a wild stallion with all of its power and to restrain that power so that the horse does not harm its human rider, right? So taking something powerful and putting some restraints and some control around that powerful thing. It goes back all the way to the Greek philosophers. It goes back before Aristotle, but Aristotle is the one who defines it the most clearly, and it is Aristotle's definition that gets adopted into the Christian tradition via this beatitude, this Greek word, and sort of guides Christian interpretation all the way up until the 17 or 1800s. And this is how Aristotle defined the Greek word praus: to get angry at the right things for the right reasons, in the right amount, for the right length of time. So to get angry at the right things, that doesn't mean you never get angry. It means you get angry at the right things. To get angry for the right reasons, so not to, give myself too personal of an example, but like if someone cuts you off in traffic and you fly off the handle, that might or might not be the right reason. In the right amount. So this idea that there are some things that you should get a little angry about, but some things you should actually get really angry about. For the right length of time. And so for Aristotle said, so people who hold grudges, those people are not meek because they hold on to anger for too long. But people who never get angry also are not meek. They are insensible. They are apathetic. And he's like, that's not good either. And so, if you've ever studied Aristotle or Greek philosophy, you know that every virtue is a sort of middle ground between two extremes, a deficiency and an excess. So for him, the excess, of course, is people who fly off the handle all the time. They hold grudges. They get really angry at small things. But the deficiency is people who never get angry at all. Like they just don't feel anger when they should. And so meekness lives right in the middle of those two things. It's the proper use of anger. And so Christian interpreters, when they read this beatitude and they see this Greek word, that's what it means for them, because that's what it means in Greek. That's how it has functioned for hundreds of years before it enters into the New Testament. John Wesley preaches on the Beatitudes in the year 1750 something, sometime in the 1750s. And John Wesley described meekness as the midline between two extremes: apathy and out of control anger, hatred, or fear. So John Wesley is using exactly the same definition that Aristotle was. And Wesley is just one example. I could pull so many more out of my pocket. The line in Romans 12:27 and 1 Peter 3:9 is often invoked as a description of what this beatitude means. Do not return evil for evil. Do not return evil for evil. So when someone does evil to you, how easy it is to strike back at them. But a meek person is someone who chooses not to. And so that line, do not return evil for evil, is almost used as a synonym of what this particular beatitude means. So I think I put a prayer, did I put this in your handout? Cornelia Plantina's prayer. So I literally read this 2 days ago because I have a little book of his prayers that is the most delightful thing. If you're looking for a new little prayer book, it's called Morning and Evening Prayers, and it's a beautiful little prayer book. And I've been using this for a couple weeks as my prayer book, and I read I can't remember if it was a morning or an evening prayer, but he wrote this, and it wasn't about the Beatitude. It just, I think it was a morning prayer, because it was about like, help me go into my day in a kind of good way. Give me a long fuse and a short memory where irritants are concerned. Make me hard to provoke. Not stoic, not naive, just hard to provoke. I may still get good and angry at injustice, which is, I'm thinking of Jesus, not the horse. After all, I'd be imitating you. I'm asking for patience, not complacence. And I thought that is a beautiful description of this particular beatitude. I'm asking for patience, not complacence. So I think even though he probably wasn't thinking about the Beatitudes, it's such a great way of understanding it. Okay, what happened? What happened? The short answer is, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what happened. One of the things that happened is English happened. There is no good direct English equivalent to this Greek word. Meek doesn't do it, right? You know, all the synonyms you came up with don't really capture this idea of restraint of anger. Gentle is a little better, I think, because of this, but still doesn't quite get at it. So one of the things is just when people started reading the Bible in English and sort of lost the Greek and the Latin. If you look at it in the Latin, it's a word that would have had very similar resonances to the Greek. They would have understood the background to it. So that's one of the things that happened. I also wonder if one of the things that happened is sort of changing understandings of Jesus around the 1800s, of like the kind of Jesus meek and mild. You know, you see the hymn about Jesus, literally Jesus meek and mild, around the same time. So I tried to kind of find exactly where we lost this, and I'm not sure I have a great answer, but I do think somewhere around the 17 or 1800s, the Christian tradition, with a few exceptions, just kind of lost this rich history. The only other reason I can think of is that in the 1800s, with the rise of what's called historical critical scholarship, which is this idea that you read the Bible not as a sacred text, but as you would read any other Bible, any other book, as a piece of literature, you start to, how do I want to say this? You start to have a bias against the past, because you start to have this idea that we, these modern people, we are enlightened. There's the Enlightenment come. We are enlightened. We have all these scientific methods, and these Christians from the past were medieval, literally medieval, right? They did not have all the tools that we have. They did all these crazy allegorizing things with scripture, and we're moving beyond that. And I think a lot of the wisdom of the past was sort of rejected at that point, especially by people who wrote commentaries. And you know that a lot of preaching comes from reading commentaries. And so I think when you start to have a break from the Christian tradition and the commentaries, you lose a lot of the richness of this past history. And so I think a lot of it just got lost. Now, not completely lost. Billy Graham was like, what is meekness? It's the restraint of anger. So like, you know, a lot of preachers kept holding on to this, but a lot of scholars let it go. Okay. I think I just had an example down here that I liked, which is from Plato's Republic. This is because I teach an honors class where I have to teach things like Plato. and Thucydides, which I haven't read since I was in college. So I read a little Plato's Republic last year when I was teaching my freshmen. And in Plato's Republic, Plato said, the rulers of a society must be meek toward their own people. Tyrants are weak because they have to use force against their own people. But it is the just ruler who is meek because they can be restrained and gentle toward their own people. And I thought that seemed relevant for things that are happening in our world today. John Paul Isaac is an African theologian who I like. And he writes that the meek person only uses their power for the benefit of others and never for their harm. And I think that's also a really good definition of meekness. So meekness, I think, is not just about how one exercises anger, but is also how one exercises power. Not to harm or to lash out or to use force, but to control those wild forces, right, in a way that does not harm. Jesus overturned tables, but he didn't punch people. So he used his anger rightly against a system that rightly he saw as harming people, but he never used violence against human beings. So I think that's another kind of example of that. Now I also want to talk a little bit about the background of this particular beatitude because it's almost a quotation of a psalm. Some of the earlier beatitudes have their roots in Isaiah chapter 61. So the blessing on the humble, blessing on those who mourn. Those beatitudes have their roots in Isaiah chapter 61, which is about the Israelites' return from exile, their kind of joyful return from exile. Your mourning shall be turned into gladness and joy. This beatitude has its roots in a psalm, in Psalm 37. And so I should say, I said the beatitude, right, when I first started this? Okay, good. Psalm 37 says, the meek shall inherit the land. Now this is a slightly different formulation of it. It doesn't say, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the land, but it just says, the meek shall inherit the land. So Jesus is almost directly quoting from Psalm 37 with this beatitude. And the reason why I think this is important is if you look at the other ways that the meek are described in this particular psalm, the meek are those who trust and delight in the Lord, and those who refrain from anger and forsake wrath. So even in the psalm, which of course was, as you know, originally written in Hebrew, but in the Greek translation uses the word praus, the same word that we get meek from in the Beatitude, the meek are closely associated with two things, refraining from anger and forsaking wrath, which we've already seen is kind of rolled up into this understanding, but also those who trust and delight in God. And so I think this shows us that meekness is not just a stance toward other people, but it is also a stance toward God. And it is a form of trust in God that we do not need to use our anger or our power to solve all the problems in the world, because that actually is God's responsibility. We join God in that project, of course, whenever and wherever we can. But I think the understanding that meek people are people who ultimately put their trust and their delight in God shows you what makes it possible to be a meek person, what makes it possible to rightly restrain and use anger, because you have this deep and fundamental trust that God is a God of justice who will set things to right. So I think it is grounded in that. And so I thought I would give just a couple examples of this. And one of them is from one of my students. So I teach a class called Forgiveness and Reconciliation, which is one of my favorite classes. I find students are so eager to talk about forgiveness. They want to know how to forgive their friends. They want to know how to heal conflicts within their own families. They want to know how to talk to their roommates, when their roommates get into arguments. So they're so eager to talk about forgiveness. And I let them write a case study on anything they want. And one of my students wrote a case study on Martin Luther King Jr.'s sermon, Loving Your Enemies. And he also quoted the Beatitude, because we had talked about the Beatitudes in this class. And he described his experiences growing up as a young black man in Baltimore. He talked about the racist comments that people have made about him, or even directly to his face. He talks about being followed by security guards when he goes into stores because they're worried that he's going to shoplift. He told me that he is afraid of being shot by the police someday because they'll think he's threatening. He talks about how angry he gets and how easy it would be to fight back. But he also talks about the real strength that it takes him not to. So he talked about this beatitude and how much it meant to him, and he talked about Martin Luther King Jr. and his sermon, Loving Your Enemies, as his example of someone who knew what it meant to be hated and threatened, and how easy it would have been for him to give into anger and hatred, and how he never did. There's a line in King's sermon that I think is so powerful. And in this sermon, if you haven't read it, you should go read it. It's an amazing sermon. King said to the people who, were threatening his family and to the people who hated him, he said, I would rather die than hate you. That's how committed he was to this idea, I think, of meekness, of the proper use and restraint of your even rightful anger. So that's my first example. Excuse me. And then the other example is from the late 19th century, so someone I do not know personally, but is this writer named Elizabeth Rundle Charles. I had never heard of her before. I have no idea who she is. But she wrote this wonderful meditation on this beatitude. And she wrote that, now remember, this is the 19th century, and she's English. People who have a tendency toward imperial ambitions or imperial domination are in special need of meekness. And I also thought that seemed relevant to today's current news cycle. And then finally, and this is kind of my transition to the next beatitude I want to talk about, I decided at one point to start looking at translations in other languages. Because I thought, I wonder what other languages do with these beatitudes. Might that show me something about the way people understand them? Because some of them are translations from the English, so that doesn't tell me a lot because it just tells me how they're translating the English. But some of them are translations from the Greek so I looked at Swedish, which was fun for me. I looked at German, I looked at French. I had some people help me with languages I don't know, Spanish, Portuguese, Chinese. In one modern German translation, the beatitude is, blessed are those who do not employ violence, for they shall inherit the earth. So, selig die keine Gewalt anwenden, for anyone who speaks German. Blessed are those who do not employ violence. And I thought, that is a lovely translation of blessed are the meek, because it gets at the heart of what meekness is, which is the refusal to use anger or to use power violently. So I thought this was a translation that did a good job of getting at what meekness means. Let me just say a very brief word about for they shall inherit the earth. One of the challenges with for they shall inherit the earth is that if, as the Christian tradition has long believed, all of them are variations on for theirs is the kingdom of heaven, or theirs is the kingdom of God, where does the earth fit into that? Because that sounds earthly. That sounds like the meek get this earth. So there are a number of ways that Christians have sort of solved this puzzle. One of them is just to be super practical. So Martin Luther is like, well, people who are meek don't get in a lot of arguments with their neighbors, so they don't lose their land. Just like super practical. So there's a bunch of just like super practical applications of this one. But there's also, I think, some more creative understandings of ones that link into the earth as kind of an element of the kingdom of God. And one of them is that the earth is actually the new heavens and the new earth, from Revelation 21. And so the idea is the meek, they may not ever get this earth, but they will inherit the new heavens and the new earth, the new creation. So that's one way. There are other weirder ways to understand it, but I don't have time probably to get into those. So, ready for the peacemakers?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is a nice segue into the peacemakers, because meekness, as I discovered, is closely related to peacemaking, except it's more of the kind of negative form, right? The kind of restraint form, like I will not use violence. Whereas peacemaking is positive. It's an action. I'm not just going to not be violent, but I'm going to actively make peace. So this one is, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God, or the sons of God. And the reason why, even though obviously this is not restricted only to male, children of God, I like sons of God, because son of God in Hebrew and in Greek, to be a son of something is to reflect the characteristics of that thing. So you might remember that Jesus had two disciples who were called the sons of thunder. Do you remember this? The sons of thunder. This did not mean that thunder was their dad, right? This meant that they were thunderous men. It probably meant that they were kind of loud and boisterous people. Sometimes in scripture you see people described as sons of light or sons of darkness. That means that they are people who have the characteristics of light or of darkness. So to be a son of something is to have the characteristics of that thing. So to be a son of God is not to be a son of God the way Jesus is the son of God, but to take on and have the characteristics of God. That's what it means to be a son of God. So that's why I like that phrase a little better than children of God, because children of God reminds us that we're adopted into God's household and that beautiful theology, which is true, but that's not what the Beatitude is doing. When it says, the peacemakers shall be called children of God or sons of God, it means you are people who show us what God is like. You are like your Father. You are like God, because what is God? God is a peacemaker, right? God makes peace between human beings. God makes peace between human beings and himself. So God is the Prince of Peace. Jesus is the Prince of Peace. And when people are peacemakers, they are imitating and reflecting that quality of their God. So that's the sort of promised command. I think that's the relationship between the two of them. And of course, peace, the Greek word eirene, which translates the Hebrew word shalom. I think we're all familiar with the word shalom. The word shalom does not just mean the absence of conflict, right? It just doesn't mean placidity. Shalom means that everyone has what they need to flourish. Shalom means wholeness. So to be people who make peace are people who create the conditions in which everybody can flourish. And so I think I like this because it's a much wider definition of peacemaking than simply like trying to stop a war, although that is included. But I think people who make peace are trying to create the conditions in which everyone is whole and everyone can flourish. So that's kind of the ground of it. And one of the things you see in the Psalms, for example, is that peace and justice are closely related to one another. So there is no peace. I mean, this is just kind of a slogan people shout on the streets, right? No justice, no peace. But that's what the Psalms tell us. There can only be peace where there is justice, because where there is injustice, people cannot be whole. People cannot flourish. And so there has to be justice for the conditions that make peace possible. Now, this one, did I put Isaiah 11 on there? Yes. Okay, I feel like I should say something about it then. In Isaiah, in this particular passage, this is the famous passage about the lion laying down with the lamb and so forth, swords being beaten into plowshares. Peace is a sign of God's new creation, right? So it is a return to the harmony of the original creation. So in the original creation, everything is shalom. Everything is at peace and harmony. The animals don't hurt each other. The humans are actually not given the animals to eat in the original creation. If you look at Genesis 1, 2, and 3, they're not allowed to eat the animals. They're only allowed to eat plants and seeds and fruit. Why? Because there's no violence in God's original creation. And to eat an animal, you have to kill it. And so there's complete, so the animals don't fear the humans in the original creation because they don't have to. And the animals don't fear one another because they don't eat one another either. And so there's this idea that all of creation is in harmony with one another and therefore at peace. So Isaiah is a vision of this return to this original creation where the animals don't harm one another, humans don't harm the animals, humans don't harm one another. So a vision of total and complete peaceableness. Okay, so this one, I'm going to kind of walk through, like, again, very briefly, what the history of this one is. And this one you can kind of think of as, like, first of all, it has like a vertical dimension, and then a lot of horizontal dimensions. And the horizontal dimensions start very small on the inside, and they get wider and wider and wider and wider. So the vertical dimension, and I think I have a slide for this one. The vertical dimension, I do, is peace with God. And so for many, many Christian writers throughout history, this is the foundation and the most important one, having peace with God. And so the peacemakers are people who help others find peace with God. So they're the evangelists and the missionaries. So this, I told you before, I showed you Laura James' main panel, and I said all the Beatitudes are little panels around the outside. So this, I'm sorry it's fuzzy, but this is one of the Beatitudes panels, and this is the blessing on the peacemakers. And you can see that she has imagined a peacemaker as someone who is baptizing this woman. And so this is a nice visual illustration of this idea that one of the ways of making peace is to help people reconcile with God and to find peace with God. And this is often seen as the foundation for all the rest. That if you do not have peace with God, how can you make peace with other people? So that's kind of the idea. It's the foundation that God's love, once you accept it, has the power to transform a person into a peaceful person, has the power to break down barriers of conflict among people. So that's the vertical dimension. Then the horizontal dimension begins. This surprised me actually. I didn't see this one coming. It began with having peace with yourself, and I was a little bit. I felt judged by this one. I was like, being a person who is not always at peace with myself, I thought, do I have to start there? Can I start with other people? But I think the idea of this one is that is twofold. One of them is just to become at peace with yourself and who you are. And how do you do that? Well, I don't know, prayer, therapy. For me, it took therapy, but certainly prayer. So to become a person at peace with yourself. But then also to become a peaceful person, which I think is not exactly the same thing. And one of the main things you see in history about this one, in terms of how to become a peaceful person, is that you need all of the other Beatitudes in order to become a peaceful person. So this is a way, again, of honoring the order of them, that the order matters, and the peacemakers is almost last. It's just before the blessing on the persecuted. So it's the 7th Beatitude. And again, if Christians believe that the order matters, then, well, you might need all of the other ones first before you can be a peacemaker. And there's a certain logic to this, I think, that peace flows from humility, from repentance, from the restraint of anger, from justice, from mercy, from a pure heart. So there's lots of really interesting Christian writing throughout history about how having the other Beatitudes and living them out is necessary in order to become a person who can make peace with other people. So that's kind of the first dimension. And then once you turn to peace with others, it starts small and it just keeps going and going and going. So first is peace with family and friends, people you live with. Sometimes these can be the hardest people to make peace with, right? Because you rub shoulders with them every day. That's not easy. And so that's one that Christians spent a lot of time thinking about. There was some wonderfully practical advice that I found in sermons and commentaries and books about this one. Like one Jesuit from the 1600s was like, don't talk at all if you're angry. Just wait. Another pastor, I can't remember what century this was in, but was like, count to 10 first, I don't know. There was lots of like very practical advice for this one about being a peacemaker with your family and friends. And then I think there's a kind of special category that I'm not sure where it falls in terms of how big this one could be, far out or quite close to home, is making peace with your enemies. And this one, of course, comes from Jesus' command to love your enemies and to pray for those who persecute you. And what many Christians have noticed is that there are two people in the Gospel of Matthew who are called the children of God. They are the peacemakers, and they are the people who love their enemies. In Matthew 5:45. So Jesus, in this section about loving your enemies, he says, look, if you love your friends and your kin, even the Gentiles do that. Like, that's fine. But that is of no credit to you. I'm asking you to be people who love your enemies, because that is the way your Father in heaven behaves. Your Father sends sunshine on the righteous and the unrighteous, and rain on the righteous and unrighteous. And one of the things that my students always think is that sunshine is good and rain is bad. But this is an agricultural society. Is rain bad? No, rain is good. What that means is that God sends good blessings, sunshine and rain, on the righteous and the unrighteous. And so Jesus says, imitate God, and you will be called children of your heavenly Father by loving your enemies. And so the people throughout history have noticed this, have said, well, if the peacemakers are children of God, and people who love their enemies are children of God, there must be a connection between those two things. So peacemakers must be people who also are willing to make peace with their enemies. And this one is a really tough one, right? This one is really hard. I don't know, I hope that I don't have any people I would actually call enemies, but do I have people that I really struggle to get along with? Yeah. Do I have people who I've been in conflicts with? Yes. Do I have people in the halls of power who I currently struggle to like at all? Yes. So the command, I think, to love our enemies raises the question of like, well, what does it mean to love our enemies? What does that actually look like? And I would go back again, I think, as good advice to Martin Luther King Jr.'s sermon on loving your enemies, because the first thing he says about it is you don't have to like your enemies in order to love them, because love is not a feeling in this particular instance. To love someone in the way that God loves is not that God feels warm fuzzies toward us, but that God wills our good at all times without exception. And that's what it means to love an enemy, to will their good at all times without exception. Now that's also hard. That's a kind of act of a will to not to want the downfall of an enemy, but to rather will their good and to act as much as it is within our power. Now, Augustine believed that sometimes the good for a person who is an enemy means that they might need to be restrained. It doesn't mean that we just let people who are enemies or terrible people go off and do whatever they want. That's not what loving them means. But it does mean that we do not have malice toward them. Just as meekness is, we don't allow anger to harbor in our hearts. We don't hold grudges or nurse hatred toward those people. I think that's part of what it means to be a peacemaker toward enemies. And I'm not saying I've perfected this one, but I think about it a lot. All right, does that make sense? Okay. The next one I think is also really challenging, and that is peace within churches. And I found a surprising amount written about this. Some of it was about peace within individual congregations, which can also be really difficult. One of my teachers at Duke, when I was there, said, the kingdom of God is like being stuck with people you wouldn't be caught dead with on a Saturday night. Like the church is a big collection of people. It's a family that we don't choose, but we're stuck with them. And sometimes it's really hard to be stuck with them. And so there's a lot of pastors throughout history who wrote about this beatitude and talked about how do you peacemake within a congregation when there are deep divisions, sometimes for very good reasons, in a congregation where people of good faith disagree deeply with one another about important issues. And peacemaking does not mean sweeping those differences under the rug, right? Again, peace is not merely the absence of conflict, but it does mean making a good faith effort to try to be, as Paul said, as much as it is within your power, and sometimes it is not within your power, but as much as it is within your power, to live at peace with all people. So a lot of pastors I read talked about that. There were also a lot of laments about this particular beatitude during the Protestant Reformation. And there were a lot of laments on all sides. Some of them not laments, some of them just anger, but a lot of laments about the way the church was splintering during the Protestant Reformation. Catholics brokenhearted at the way the unity of their church was being destroyed. Protestants brokenhearted at the way the unity of the church was being damaged through their actions. And Protestants who were heartbroken at the way that other Protestants were attacking them. The Anabaptists especially felt caught in the crosshairs because everybody was attacking them. They were getting attacked by the Lutherans, the Calvinists, and the Catholics. And the Anabaptists were like, what happened to the church being people who love one another? Thomas Watson was a Puritan preacher who preached multiple sermons on this beatitude. And at one point in one of his sermons, he lamented that in his own time, instead of saying, see how the Christians love one another, people were saying, see how the Christians snarl at one another. And so there's a lot of real pain that I read in that time period in history and down through kind of successive generations as the church kept kind of splintering off in different directions about whether those divisions in the churches were a failure of peacemaking. But it was a real struggle because, for example, John Calvin said, we cannot have peace at the expense of truth. We cannot have peace at any price. So there was a real collision, I think, in some ways between sort of purity of heart, if you will, and doctrine, and the need to sort of like have a kind of what they saw as like the truth or pure doctrine, and the blessing on the peacemakers. And how can we do both of these things at the same time? So that was a huge challenge, and I read so much just kind of laments over this particular beatitude in that time period in history. I don't know what more to say about that one. It was just like, this one made me sad because it was a really tough one. And then you expand out a little bit more. You get to neighbors and neighborhoods. And I think there's a lot of really interesting and good work being done with like the Christian Community Development Association, if you know them, about peacemaking like within neighborhoods, and how to bring sort of Christ peace and Christ flourishing into a neighborhood. So for several years I worshiped in a church that was part of the Christian Community Development Association, and I learned a lot from them. So neighbors and neighborhoods is sort of another circle in peacemaking, I think. And then nations. So this is also a really interesting one because you see very little about this particular beatitude in relation to war or peace among nations until you get to Martin Luther. You do see some with Augustine. So we'll start this. So go back to my old friend Augustine again. I never thought as an evangelical biblical scholar I would spend this much of my time thinking about Augustine. But he's an interesting fellow. So as you may know, Augustine did not invent the just war tradition. He got it in some ways from a Roman orator named Cicero. But he codified it for the Christian tradition. And Augustine wrote a couple things about this particular beatitude, but most of his writing on the just war tradition isn't really connected to this beatitude. But his argument essentially was that the higher good is avoiding violence. The higher good is always avoiding violence, but that he made allowances that in some cases there would be times in which Christians could still be peacemakers and wage war. Now, as you well know, there are Christians who are on different sides of this debate, right? There are some Christians who think you cannot be a peacemaker and pick up the weapons of war. You simply can't. It's a contradiction in terms. Where there's other Christians, Augustine and the just war tradition among them, who say, no, sometimes, in fact, to make true peace, you have to wage war. You have to do it. It's a lesser good, but it's a good that sometimes has to take place in order to create the true conditions for peace. But that's kind of it. I mean, you don't have a lot on this beatitude until you get to the Reformation, until you get to Luther. Because Luther, of course, thinks that, not of course, but I discovered, Luther thinks that all the beatitudes are not about the love of God, but about the love of neighbor. So he kind of has this way of saying all the Beatitudes are to orient you toward how to love your neighbor. So they're all about life in the public sphere. And if that's true, then blessed are the peacemakers has to in some way be about life in the public sphere. And so he argued that the seventh Beatitude does not prohibit the waging of war. It's not a blanket prohibition on war, but he says it does seriously limit it. So he argued, quote, anyone who claims to be a Christian and a child of God, so this is quoting from the second half of the Beatitude, right, for they shall be called children of God, not only does not start war or unrest, but he gives help and counsel on the side of peace wherever he can. So Luther is actually taking a narrower stance than Augustine, because Augustine thought sometimes in order to make peace, you had to go to war, you had to start a war. And Luther says you're not allowed to start it. If someone else starts it, you might have to step in and respond.